Hello, dear colleague. Every sewing project begins with drafting a pattern. You can draft a pattern from scratch using any construction method you know, or you can use a more advanced approach, the pattern hacking method. That is exactly what this mini course is about. The essence of this method is that an individual pattern is created on the basis of an existing master pattern. Among professionals working in custom dressmaking, this is the most popular method. It is suitable for all types of garments: blouses, trousers, jackets, sundresses, and lightweight dresses, lingerie, as well as coats, jackets, and outerwear. The most important thing is to have a high-quality, professionally developed master pattern and to know how to transform it into a customized cutting pattern according to individual measurements. Why pattern hacking beats drafting from scratch? Saves time. What takes days to draft can be done in hours with a master pattern. Fewer mistakes. Tested patterns avoid calculation errors that can ruin a draft. More accurate, master patterns make measurement issues easy to spot and fix. With practice, you'll skip paper corrections and adjust right on fabric, and will be cutting a corset dress in just a couple of hours. Let's take a closer look at measurements. Specifically, we'll talk about how to measure a client when preparing to make a dress with a corset foundation. Imagine a client comes to you with a sketch of her wedding gown. You begin by taking her measurements. For this example, I'll only list the most essential ones we'll be discussing. Bust circumference, 115 centimeters, or 45 1/4 inches. Underbust circumference, 85 centimeters, or 33 1/2 inches. Waist circumference, 90 centimeters, or 35 1/2 inches. Bust center or bust span, also known as the distance between bust points, 21 centimeters, or 8 1/4 inches. To use the pattern hacking method, you also need to measure the pattern that you'll be using as your base. Patterns already include seam allowances. Since the pattern hacking method is applied to resize rather than restyle, we'll be making adjustments to the patterns with seam allowances included. Let's assume you decide to use a pattern from the course plus-size dress with hidden corset. I record the measurements of this pattern in a new column next to the client's. Since the client came to you with a sketch of a corset dress, this already tells us she wants her figure to be shaped and enhanced. Now, let's look again at her measurements. If we were to draft a pattern using these exact values, there would be no figure correction at all. The dress would simply follow her natural body shape. To achieve shaping with a corset, we also need to correct the measurements. Notice that her waist circumference is actually larger than her underbust. Now compare this with the reference pattern. The underbust is 80 centimeters, or 31 1/2 inches. The waist is 75 centimeters, or 29 1/2 inches. For a proper hourglass silhouette, the waist measurement should be at least 5 centimeters smaller, that's 2 inches smaller, than the underbust. If the difference is less, the figure takes on a straight column shape. Only a very strong hip-to-waist difference can compensate for this. Taking this into account, what should the corset dress measurements look like in order to noticeably improve the client's figure? So instead of the client's natural waist of 90 centimeters, or 35 1/2 inches, the corset must reduce it to 80 centimeters, or 31 1/2 inches. That means the corset needs to provide at least 10 centimeters or 4 inches of waist reduction. Testing the client's corset tolerance. Before committing, you need to check whether the client's body can actually tolerate that level of reduction. Here's how to do it. Wrap a wide strip of strong fabric around her waist. Tighten it to simulate the effect of the corset. If her body allows for this adjustment, you can safely proceed with the corset-based gown. And don't forget, when recording her waist measurement for the pattern, you must write down 80 centimeters, or 31 1/2 inches, instead of her natural 90 centimeters, or 35 1/2 inches. If, however, the client's abdominal anatomy doesn't allow for that reduction, you'll need to set aside the corset idea and choose another dress style. Now, let's pay attention to the bust center or bust span measurement. In corsetry, this has a slightly different meaning than in regular dressmaking. In everyday garments, bust center or bust span simply refers to the distance between the bust points, or apex to apex, which determines dart placement for a basic bodice draft. For corsetry, the bust span is not just a dart placement measurement. It's your guide for positioning the vertical seams, or princess seams. When you take this measurement, you're determining how close together or how far apart the seams should be. This depends on the design, the client's figure, and the overall visual effect you want to achieve. After this kind of analysis, adjusting the values for your draft, the dress will turn out exactly as the client expects. To effectively master the pattern hacking method, you need to learn how to connect the client's measurements with the corresponding parts of the pattern. Focus less on memorizing the names of the measurements and more on understanding which sections of the pattern they define. To make this clear, mark the outlines of the corset and all the style lines directly onto a dress form. Then, as you take measurements from the form, notice how those lines correspond to the garment itself. Using this method, you can even invent your own measurements. For example, I use a measurement called clip or chicken paw. You won't find this term in any classical pattern-making textbook. But with pattern hacking, this measurement makes it easy to determine the shape and placement of the upper corset edge, as well as the size of an integral cup. The same is true for the side height measurement. In traditional textbooks, this has a different name. But in pattern hacking, it works perfectly. It shows where the highest point of the corset side seam should be. The value depends on the style and on the angle of the upper corset edge. To determine the position of the bust line relative to the waistline, both on the body and on the pattern, we use the measurement side height to bust line. To define where the abdominal circumference should be measured, we use the distance between the waistline and the stomach line. If you need to create any additional measurement, simply select a line or a point on the pattern that you can use as a reference when making changes. Most often, these are the waistline or the bust line. A common reference point is the intersection of the bust seam and the bust line. To measure the depth of the hollow between stitched cups, take the measurement from seam to center front. This number will be greater than half the bust span. It tells you how far the center front line needs to be shifted outward in order to form the fullness of the cup. To set the depth of the neckline, measure from the waistline to the lowest point of the neckline. To determine the shape of a neckline that lies close to the bust line, it is better to use the measurement called neckline height from bust line. For a full guide on which measurements are mandatory and which are auxiliary, see the Ultimate Measurements Guide. The number of auxiliary measurements is not limited. The process is simple. First, measure the body. Then transfer those numbers to the paper pattern to check accuracy. This is the beauty of pattern hacking. There are no complicated calculations. You simply take a measurement and plot it directly onto the paper. Once you know the measurements of your base pattern, compare them to the client's. For example, if the side height on the pattern is 18 centimeters or about 7 inches, but the client's is 17 centimeters or 6 inches and 3/4 inches, then you shorten the side seam on the pattern by 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch. In this course, you will see many examples of how to use the pattern hacking method. At the beginning, you'll watch lessons that were recorded before I developed the automated calculation program. In those, all the calculations are done by hand, with formulas carefully explained. Later, I created software that makes the process faster, easier, and more accurate. In the later lessons, you'll see how to apply changes to the pattern using the program's calculations. And besides pattern hacking, you'll find other ways of developing patterns. You'll learn how to design lace overlays to wear over low-cut corset dresses, how to draft different strap variations directly on paper without complicated math, and many other practical methods of pattern construction and design. Beyond this mini course, you will find this method in almost every course in our library. This is a professional and frankly the easiest way to create custom-fitted bespoke garments. In the next chapters, you will find practical examples of the pattern hacking, taken from different courses from our catalogue. You'll practice both manual calculations and automated using our exclusive calculation software. Happy sewing!